program. And as you can see, we are recording the session. um, so welcome to today's session on developing a theory of change. Zoom sessions are definitely a team sport, so special thanks as always to my terrific NSP colleagues, Monica Kelly and Betsy Johnson, for all of their behind the scenes assistance and their great teamwork in planning for and managing the logistics for today's session. And since it's a question that always comes up, we will be sharing the session recording as well as the slides with all of you following today's session. In terms of breakout sessions, we're not 100% sure, but we may be having a breakout session at which we really encourage you to keep your cameras on and to fully participate. I think you'll get a lot more out of the session that way. Betsy will be posting the survey for this session in the chat towards the end, and she'll also be sending you the survey. We'll also be sending it to you immediately following the session. It is the only price of admission, as we say, and we really do value your feedback and take your comments seriously, so please do take a few minutes to fill out the survey afterwards. Our presenter today will be pausing at several points to take questions. And again, we encourage you to engage in the session, enter your questions in the chat so that you get as much out of the session as possible. And you can do that at any time that a question pops into your head during the session, and because we do want it to be as interactive as possible. If there are questions that we're not able to get to during the session, our presenter has generously agreed to stick around immediately following the session for what we call after class time. So if you have some lingering questions, you can stick around a little bit afterwards. And with that, I'm delighted that our presenter today is Dr. Elena Ragusa, who is president of Drive Evaluation Studio, which is a research and evaluation consulting firm that works in partnership with clients to create evaluations, applied research projects, and strategies that make sense for their work, while at the same time building evaluation capacity in staff along the way. Elena is an experienced facilitator and a college instructor, and she regularly teaches about research design, program evaluation, data analysis, community psychology, and organizational psychology. I should also mention that Elena is working with the Hartford Foundation staff to help us to increase our knowledge in the area of evaluation. And I know that she works hard to make her content feel accessible, actionable, practical, and also fun. So with that, the program is all yours, Elena.
Thanks, Mayor, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you. And as you might have caught Mayor say, we're not sure if we're doing a breakout, and the reason for that is because we're going to iterate in real time here, right? So we're going to try and make this as actionable for folks as possible, and so we'll make some tweaks as we go, or some decisions as we go to see how we're going to use that time most effectively. So to that end, this summer, some of you may remember participating in a survey where we asked topics of interest for sessions on evaluation. That was sent to all of you, and folks from many of your organizations might have completed it, where we asked, what are you interested in if you had a couple of sessions around research evaluation and tracking data? And the top two responses by far on that survey were: one, tips for evaluative thinking in organizations, and two, understanding and developing theories of change. So we did a session in September on evaluative thinking, and I see many folks from that session back today. So hello to those new friends. And then I'm here today to talk to you about theories of change. And I'll say that I was a little bit surprised that theories of change made the top of the list. It's not always the most fun or popular topic for folks to engage with. But I'm happy that there's interest around it. So as Mayor said, I try and do my best to make this kind of work interesting and accessible and a little bit fun. So we'll try and do that today. Before we jump into our content, I think it's important for us to build a little bit of context. So let's learn a little bit more about who's here, your knowledge and your comfort level with theories of change, and kind of how we want to use that time today. So to do that, we're going to go through 4 polls. Just kick us off. The first one is a little bit more about you. So what role do you play in your organization? And you'll see that one pop up if it's not already on your screen. Senior leadership, management, program staff, pick the one that best fits, right? This might not be a perfect fit, pick what best fits here. And let's see what the composition of our group is. All right, it looks like folks are still answering. We've got nearly half in a position of senior leadership. And then we have a good representation from management and program staff. Sorry, I got muted for a sec. Can you hear me? Great. A couple of fellow research and evaluation folks, and we've got some fundraising, marketing, and IT folks. No others. I was wondering if we'd have any others. So we have a pretty good distribution here. This is good. Do you see the results of the poll up on your screen as well? Great. All right, so let's go to our second one. When I hear logic model or theory of change, either one of these terms, and I know that they're not exactly the same, but go with me on this. When I hear a logic model or a theory of change, which best fits your comfort level here? I have no idea what we're talking about. I have a general idea. I can understand this, but I don't really think I can make one. I've done this work before. Oh, I've got at least 3 folks that could do this work if my power goes out, so I'm glad. I might pass the reins to you if anything happens. Still answering. So folks, somewhere in the middle of this, good distribution between those middle 3. All right, so we've got a couple folks at the extremes. And then, as we might expect, most of our group sort of fluctuating somewhere between, I have a general sense, I understand it, but I don't know that I could make one, and I've done this kind of work before. So the good news is there will likely be a little bit for each person here, right? Because we've got a broad distribution. You might hear some stuff that you already know. You might hear a lot of new stuff depending on where you fall along the spectrum. But I'm fairly confident that there'll be something for everybody. All right, number 3, at least one, again, pick the one that best fits. At least one of the programs with which I work has an articulated logic model or theory of change. And by articulated, I mean written out somewhere on paper that has been already established. All right. I have to tell you, I'm surprised by this one. So I did not anticipate that this level of nearly a third of our folks would already have an articulated logic model or theory of change. So this is good to know. This is where we will use this information in real time. And a sort of true, let me explain group. I love those answers. I kind of want to take a good chunk of time and hear your explanations. But we can't do that now, but I'd love to kind of hear what that means at some point. And as expected, I would expect that at least half of our group doesn't have one at all. So this is, again, I think the folks that don't have one at all, quite frankly, I think you'll probably find a lot of information here. And I think the other 2 groups will be able to get something out of it too. And then our last question, what are you hoping to get out of this session? So with all that as a backdrop, what brings you here today? And this is a check all that apply, so you can pick multiple answers here. Do you want to know what it is, including each of the specific components and how they work? Do you want to understand how and why you would use it? Do you want to understand how we would build one for an existing program, how we would build one for a new program? And if it's something else, if you're picking other, I'd love for you to be able to type that into the chat so we know. All right, so it looks like folks are still answering. Good. So a good distribution here between what it is, how we use it. Clearly, folks want to understand how to use it for an existing program. We'll definitely do that. And how we use it for a new initiative, which is slightly different than how we would build it for an existing program. So we'll reference that as well. And then 5 people indicated other. If you feel comfortable writing in the chat what your other is, how to get your leadership team on board to create a theory of change. That is a great topic. If we don't get to it by 11:30, I encourage you, Christina, to stick around for those 15 minutes afterwards, and we can absolutely talk about that. And that goes to everyone. If we don't get to something, another person on getting leadership involved. So if we don't get to that during our primary time, let's talk about it for a couple minutes after if folks are available. Thank you for engaging in our content and our polls. This is really helpful for me, so I can think about how to engage, how to tweak our content as we move forward together. So with that, let's jump into a little bit of an agenda and how we'll use that time together. So what I'm thinking that we'll do is we'll split our session into 2 chunks, right? Based on what I just saw in our poll, we have 2 primary objectives. One is around a little bit of a kind of a theory, what theory of change is, why we use it, what it entails, and the components, and specifically a theory of change. So I know some folks work with logic models. So we'll talk about a theory of change in more detail. And then in the second chunk, we'll talk about how we can go about doing this for our program at our own organization. We'll reference how to do it for a new initiative, but we'll spend a little bit more time on how to do it for an existing initiative, since there's our existing program, since there's a little bit more interest there. So we'll do kind of a little bit of a theory of change. Well, I'm calling it a theory of change 101, sort of like the nuts and bolts first, and then we'll do steps to building a theory of change right after. We'll also have a group exercise. We can we'll put that right in between those 2 sections so we can have some time actually working through this content a little bit. So we'll do that by way of agenda. And in terms of managing expectations a little bit. So this is a dense topic, right? There's no better way to say that. There's a lot of content in today's session. The goal here, we have an hour and a half together, gang. At this point, we have 75 minutes together. So the goal here is not that you're an expert by the end of this session. It's just not realistic. The goal is that you leave knowing more than you knew coming in, right? That you move further along the spectrum of comfort with this as a process, with this as a tool, and that you have some concrete next steps should you want to go back and do something like this or from this at your own organization. Right, so that is what I'm hoping we get out of our time together. By the end of our session together, you might want to go back and do a full theory of change for something soup to nuts, or you might just go back and want to have one specific conversation with your team specific to one element of this. Either one of those is fantastic, right? So both of those would be a win. And then you see this word cloud on the slide. I am fully aware and own that the world of research and evaluation includes a lot of jargon, right? And like insular language, maybe more than some other fields. I will do my best to stay away from that. But if you hear something and you're not sure what I'm talking about or what it means, please ask. Let's normalize asking for clarification on things. And just please use I love that we're already using the chat. Use the chat throughout. Ask questions, add comments. Mayor and the team from the foundation are going to be monitoring it in case I miss something. So please engage with that chat. All right. So do you ever, this is where my brain goes. Do you ever watch a talk show on television, any sort of show where they have a cooking segment and they show you a really delicious looking pie or a casserole at the beginning as a teaser for what you'll be making, what they'll be making probably right after a commercial break or something, a couple nods, I see you. And it usually is like a perfectly prepared something. It's like a perfectly prepared pie or perfectly prepared casserole. And you know that when you attempt to make the same thing, it's not going to look like that, right? But they show it to you to pique your interest. That's what I'm about to do here. So I'm going to show you the cooking. Andre, I'm hungry too. Maybe that's why I use that example. I'm going to show you the television show cooking segment version of a theory of change here, right? So this is our cooking segment theory of change. The text is tiny. You don't need to worry about the text right now. But what I'll tell you is And this is not my theory of change at all, right? I don't take any ownership of this or responsibility. It is well put together. It looks great, probably smells fantastic. And it seems kind of easy to make when you look at it like this, right? I show it to us now because there were a couple folks, that said they don't even know what we're talking about. So for anyone that's never seen a theory of change, here you go. This is a theory of change. This is a very pretty one, but this is a theory of change. This is one of thousands probably of depictions of what a theory of change could look like. Sometimes they're much more narrative or fully narrative. Sometimes there are boxes on a screen with arrows in between them, like a diagram. This happens, as I said, to be a very pretty one. That part is less important than the content, right? The content is what's important here. So in this theory of change, we have a section called enabling conditions. This is this in purple. We have a section called guiding principles. This is the section in brown at the bottom. We have a section called what we do at the top. We have a section of short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, long-term impacts. And then we even have in this tiny little text over here, a vision statement, right? The content here is what's important. So this is ultimately what we're building towards, something like this when we're working on a theory of change. But how do we get there? So let's go all the way back to the beginning, right? So this is our teaser. Let's go all the way back to the beginning to talk about what a theory of change is and what these different components are before we talk about building it. And folks, you'll have, I see some people taking notes. I love that. Take notes all day. You're also going to have these slides later, so you can always refer back to them. All right. So when we're talking about theory of change, or when I'm talking about theory of change with my colleagues, then this is what I'm talking about. I am talking about a conceptual roadmap for how and why an intervention is expected to achieve its intended impact, right? It's telling you the impact you're going to have and why you expect to have it. It's a way of describing your programming so we know where we're going, how we will generally get there, and the connection between our activities and our outcomes, right? Because if we don't know where we're going, any road will get us there. So this idea is moving us through from activities to an intended outcome, what we'll see along the way. A theory of change has three primary purposes. This next slide might be helpful for the folks that are trying to get their leadership team on board for doing work like this, right? So there are three purposes. First, it is a planning tool. So it maps out your strategy. And what the part that's really cool about a theory of change is it makes your assumptions about what you're doing explicit, right? So it provides this opportunity to sort of consider if your work is passing that sniff test where, yeah, if we do this, we should reasonably expect this. So it forces you to kind of think about those connections. It is also a communication tool. Theory of change is actually a fantastic communication tool because you spend all of this time when you develop a theory of change building consensus around language and picking terms and picking outcomes. So as a result, you have common language about what you're doing and what you expect to happen. And that common language can then permeate throughout your organization. It can be used for proposals. It can be used for reports. It can be used for grant writing. It can even be used at your high school reunion when you go tell people what you do for a living and you need that like 30-second version of what you do, right? So there's a lot of efficiency that can be found on the back end after you go through the process of norming on some of this language in terms of activities and outcomes. And then the way that it's, I would say, most commonly used is as a blueprint for evaluation, right? So if you have a theory of change, you've identified what you plan to achieve and when you plan to achieve it. So then when you go to evaluate later, you're setting up tools to capture the extent to which those things are actually mapping out the way that you expected. So again, you find efficiency later by investing in this process earlier. So we engage in a process like this because it can help us plan, it can help us communicate about our work, and it ultimately helps us evaluate the effectiveness of the interventions and the strategies that we're engaging in. As a roadmap, though, it is not turn-by-turn instructions, right? So it's not a work plan. It's not providing you step by step, this is what we're doing. And it is also not a static document. I think this is one of the biggest frustrations I see with folks, and it's a real one, and I get it. You spend all this time investing in a process to put something together, and you never really consider it final because it always iterates. But that's the reality of the work that we do. So it is a living, breathing document that we make edits to over time as our work and our context shifts. I see a question in the chat about the difference between creating a theory of change for a specific program and creating one for an entire programming department. We're going to focus primarily, and there is a difference, right? We're going to focus primarily on creating a theory of change for a specific program. You can create organizational theories of change, absolutely, that look across the different elements of what you do, and you have a vision as an organization. It's slightly different. The process and the steps look the same, but wherever we're talking about program elements, right at the program level, you would be thinking about different elements of your organization to bubble up.
And Elena, there's just one other question in the chat. A few people, including Leah, said, are there pretty templates like the one you put up earlier for the Nourish project that we can just plug into?
That would be awesome. I don't know. So I don't have any pretty templates like that. I have some templates that are not so pretty. But that would be, so not that we'll have today, but let's not lose that question, because if they exist somewhere, maybe we can find them and get them for folks. The ones that I've seen that are really pretty like that, there are definitely diagram type templates. In fact, one of the resources that I'll share, there are going to be a bunch of resources later that you get to take with you after today. And one of them is a little bit of a template, but it's more of the kind of the diagrammy one. The ones that I've seen that are really pretty are usually tied in some way to that organization's work, right? So I've seen ones where if it's environmental work, the theory of change looks like a garden, right? Or like they're very sort of thoughtfully designed with the graphics of what that organization does. So beyond the sort of diagrammy version, I do not have really pretty templates. You might be onto something for a business opportunity though, Leah. All right. And Mayor's exactly right. You can always look at others. There are tons. If you even just Google theory of change, you'll see a bunch of templates that give you some good ideas for how to design one. So there are four main, if you're one of the folks that's on the end of the spectrum of like, I'm not really sure what we're talking about when we talk about a theory of change, remember this, 4 key components, and we'll talk about each of these. First, you want to ensure you have context, economic, political, cultural. These are the things outside. We're going to talk about each of these in more detail, by the way. So at a quick broad stroke, these are things that are outside of your program, but they influence you in some way. The second, you're going to have a chunk of strategies, interventions, activities, actions. You can call them whatever you want. These are the things that you're doing in your program, right? The services that you're delivering. Third, you're going to have a section about the measurable changes that come from what you do. These are our outcomes and our impacts. Right? The outcomes are the measurable changes as a result of what we do. And the impact is the accumulation of outcomes. It's the so what. So you've achieved all these specific things, so what? That is the bigger level impact, right? The outcomes are their measurable changes, and the impact is the so what that comes from this accumulation of outcomes. And then, in my opinion, the secret sauce of a theory of change is this last chunk, the assumptions. Right? These are the beliefs, they're the hunches, they're the things that underpin the connections between your activities and your outcomes and your context. This is what makes it a theory, right? And this is what differentiates it from a logic model. So I don't want to get into semantics. Some people use these terms interchangeably. There are many ways to create a logic model. There are many ways to create a theory of change. Some of you may even have logic models that have other components, but I've circled here in very sketchy circling handwriting, the differences between the main difference between a logic model and a theory of change. A logic model usually has some sort of action, intervention, activity, and some sort of output and outcome. The big differences that we tend to see when we look across logic models and theories of change are context and assumptions. So context and assumption usually lives with a theory of change, doesn't necessarily live with a logic model. Right? So logic models typically, and I love logic models. There's a great time, place, and reason for them. Logic model typically is a little more concrete. It's a little more operational. It's usually more succinct than a theory of change would be. You have inputs, right? The things you're putting into the work. You have then your actions or your activities. You have outputs, the things that are coming out of the work, and then typically you have outcomes. Theories of change end up being just a little bit more theoretical or a little bit more philosophical. And they have a different purpose, right? So a logic model explains what you're doing, and a theory of change should explain why you're doing it. What you think will have, what the theory behind what is happening. Is there a reason to have, so an example of context, we're going to talk, Christina, I'm going to answer your question in a sec. Marlene, is there a reason to have both? You can absolutely have both if it depends. Yes, you could have both for an internal and external audience, right? So you could create, when you create a theory of change, you think about the audiences that you're creating it for. Typically, a theory of change helps explain the why, which it could be for stakeholders, could be for leadership, could be for participants. And a logic model could be really helpful for people implementing a program, right? Because it's a little more concrete, it's a little more exacting. If you're going to have one over the other, if you're going to pick one, depends on the nuance of your circumstance, but a theory of change is usually a little more all-encompassing. So I would say aim for a theory of change. You could work pretty easily from a theory of change into a logic model if you ever need that level of operationalization that comes from a logic model. So how a theory of change flows. It's essentially this. Again, if you're on our end of the spectrum of like, what are we really talking about? Remember this slide. It comes down to if we do these things, right, our strategies and our interventions, we will see these changes, short and midterm outcomes, so that we achieve this ultimate vision. That's essentially what it boils down to. It gets more complex when you're building the thing, but it essentially boils down to this. And all of this is informed by our context and connected by our assumptions. So this is essentially our flow. And I want to talk about each of these components individually in a little bit more detail. So let's talk first about context. And this gets to the question of context being different. So context, again, these are the opportunities, the challenges, the elements outside of our control, right? We're responding to them with our work, or we're minimally at least operating within them. As context shifts, right? So as the circumstances outside of our organization, the cultural factors, the opportunities, the challenges, the political factors, the economic factors, the global pandemic factors, as these things shift outside of our organization, outside of our work, our activities tend to shift in response to them, or could shift in response to them. Whenever I talk about this, I do this little like action, which is why I put gears on the slide, because that's what I'm trying to show here, right? Picture these gears where when you tweak one, the other things that are connected to it tweak a little bit, move a little bit too, right? So when we shift our context, our activities might shift. And as a response, our short-term outcomes, the things that come straight out of our activities or closely following our activities, they might shift too, right? So as one piece of this shifts, we have to think about the downstream impact. On the right side of this slide, we have some examples of what you might find in context, right? So a theory of change that has a context section might have a box that looks just like this. These are all accurate data, by the way, these are real data. And this is the type of thing that we'd see in context depending on the program that is developing the theory of change. So look at these two statements that are bulleted on the right. For what type, and they're not necessarily part of the same theory of change, they're just two examples. For what type of organization or program might this be relevant context? You can unmute or you can put an answer in the chat. For what type of organization might this be relevant context in their theory of change?
A DEI organization.
Sure, absolutely. A DEI organization. Thank you. A food pantry, somebody said. Absolutely. An after-school program, absolutely. Right, so the idea here is that the context, organization working with hunger, education, social services, all of these could be relevant context for any of them or all of them. Right, so the idea is that context is influencing, is existing outside of your organization and influencing the conditions that your target population or your work is happening in. No need to correct yourself, Deborah, we knew what you meant. So after context, we have strategies or activities. This one's really straightforward, right? If you're doing a program level theory of change, these are the elements of your program: mentoring, tutoring, classes, meetings, seminars, yoga classes, whatever you might be doing. If you're doing an organizational level theory of change, somebody asked about doing kind of the organizational one before. If you're doing an organizational level theory of change, these are the various programs that you run, right? We typically express these as an action, and they get listed out in the theory of change as a section. This is what we do. So in response to this context that we just told you about, in response to these conditions, we do X. And then outcomes. So this one gets a little more complex. So chances are you have outcomes for your program, whether you call them that or not. They're the things that you expect to happen as a result of what you're doing. These are the things that we are achieving, right? Or the changes that are coming in response to our strategies, or the changes that we're hoping for in response to our strategies and our interventions. At an individual level, so if you're working with participants, individual participants, these can be shifts in things like behavior, beliefs, attitudes, relationships, right? If you're working at a systems level for your work, these can be things like shifts in policy, how services are provided, shifts in networks, shifts in the environment. But either way, you're expecting something to happen. These are the things for which we are holding ourselves, or others are holding us accountable. Our stakeholders, our funders, our board, our community members, right? These are the things that we're saying we're going to change as a result of our work. To come up with outcomes, we have to consider what we're trying to accomplish, and what is probably the scarier question, whether or not the activities we're doing are actually going to lead to and accomplish those things, right? And those are not always one and the same. So there's what we want to change, and there's what the activities for an existing program, what the activities that we're doing are going to actually lead to. So if we're providing mental health services for veterans, for example, we probably won't have an outcome that talks about higher academic performance for Hartford youth, right? Those things are not connected to one another, at least on the surface. So there should be a logical connection between your activities and the outcomes that you're expecting. When we talk about outcomes, just like when we talk about goals, we talk about them typically being SMART. Folks have probably heard that SMART acronym. And if you were with us in September, you'll remember we talked about SMARTY. So goals and outcomes should be SMARTY. What that means is they should be specific.
Measurable.
They should be measurable, right? You know it. They should be attainable. They should be relevant for your work. They should be time-based or time-bound. They should be inclusive. That's our I, and they should be equitable. And we could do a whole session on how outcomes can and should be inclusive and equitable. And to be totally transparent with you, a 2-minute conversation here about that is not going to do that justice by any stretch. But a good place to start, at least a place to start that conversation, is to think about involving the people that you're setting outcomes about in the process of setting up those outcomes with you. Right? That is the tip of the iceberg for that conversation, but it's a good first step in creating outcomes that are more inclusive and are more equitable. The people that you're setting outcomes about, your participants, your target population, your beneficiaries, include them in the process of setting up what those outcomes are or should be for their participation in your programming. All too often, we're doing this work by ourselves in our offices with our team. Right? And so including some of our beneficiaries, our target population, our participants, our community partners in it is a good place to start. One of the biggest places where we see folks get hung up on in this part of setting outcomes is making outcomes measurable. So this isn't just true for a theory of change, right? This is a challenge in evaluation more generally. Theory of change or not, chances are you have some outcomes that you're expecting from your program. If you already have them, and a lot of folks said they have theories of change already. If you already have a theory of change, review those outcomes that you have articulated in your theory of change and consider the extent to which they are measurable. How will you know that you have achieved this thing? That how will you know part is the measurable nature part of an outcome. This too, like the conversation we just had on inclusion and equity, this could be a whole session in and of itself, right? Setting measurable outcomes. But a tip here too, all outcomes should have two parts. When you're writing an outcome, ensure it has two parts. You want to ensure it includes the group or the condition that you're targeting for change and what you expect to be different about it. That is a starting point for making things more measurable, right? Who is being targeted for change and what we expect to be different about that group or that process or that condition. So the two examples on the slide, this is actually I put together a theory of change for my dog becoming a healthier dog. So this is one of the items in my theory of change. My dog, the group targeted for change, stops eating the trash. That is the desired behavior. Or another example, residents in Greater Hartford, it's our group targeted for change, have consistent access to food. That is the desired change. Still with me? Let's see. Give me some thumbs up, give me some nods, give me some questions. What do we have? We're looking good? All right, we're looking good. So let's talk a little bit about timeframes that come with outcomes. This is a question that we get a lot when creating theories of change. So when we think about outcomes, we have to consider time frame, right? Sometimes the time frame is set for us. It could be the length of a grant. It could be a natural cycle of something that's happening. So if your goal is to move students toward on-time high school graduation, right, you might have until their slated graduation date. That outcome might be built in for you, or that time frame might be built in for you. And sometimes we're establishing those time frames ourselves. In a theory of change, we usually have 2 to 3 time frames. We talk about short-term outcomes. We talk about intermediate or midterm outcomes. And then we usually talk about either long-term outcomes or impact. Often we use those terms interchangeably. Outcomes tend to be progressive. So something happens first. That thing usually happens as a result of or closely following your activities. So you do something happens as a result. These are your short-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes tend to be the ones that we have the most control over because they're most closely tied to our programming, right? So those short-term outcomes we can typically achieve because they're most closely tied to our programming. If all goes as planned, sometime after that, something else happens, and it comes from your intervention and your short-term outcomes being met. And those are your intermediate or your midterm outcomes, right? Those happen later. And then the accumulation of all those intermediate or midterm outcomes with some additional assumptions along the way they lead to your long-term outcomes. There is no clear science for how to group things into short, intermediate, or long-term outcomes, but I'll tell you two common approaches that work in different scenarios. The first is backwards mapping, or you might have engaged in or heard people refer to things like necessary preconditions for change, right? That is a fancy way of saying we start with our long-term outcome or the impact that we want to have, and we work backwards. So if we're going to use that on-time high school graduation example, right? Our long-term outcome is on-time high school graduation. We ask ourselves, what needs to happen before that to know that we're on pace for on-time high school graduation? Maybe it's that we need to see students registered for a full year, a full course load in their senior year. Maybe it's that students need to have completed a certain number of credits by the end of their junior year. These would be the examples of the intermediate outcomes on the way to that long-term outcome. And then to get to the short-term outcomes, you ask the same question. What needs to happen before those intermediate outcomes to get to them? Well, maybe it means that the students have to pass their sophomore year courses. Or maybe it means they need to meet with their guidance counselor in their freshman year. So you can backwards map your way into outcomes. Or the second way that I've seen work fairly well is, and I like this way. I think it works. Yeah, I like them both, but I think this one works really well. You grab a pad of Post-its or any other scraps of paper that you have sitting around, and you do a big brain dump of everything that needs to happen in order for your impact to occur, right? So in order for in this example, your students to graduate high school on time, put them all down. They need to meet with their guidance counselor freshman year. They need to pass all their sophomore year classes. They need to register for a full course load. You just put them all down. Don't worry about where they fit. These are all the preconditions that have to exist for your long-term outcome or your impact to happen. And then after they're all out there, you start to group them together. That's why Post-its or scraps of paper are nice for this, because you can actually move stuff around, right? So this has to happen before this, or this has to come after that, or this happens around the same time as this. And you start to group them together. And then you naturally develop some time frames. Well, this chunk has to happen first. This chunk has to happen next. This chunk will then happen last. And you can put time frames around them, right? So either way. And somebody asked in the chat for a rough time frame for short, medium, and long term. There you go. So this is not necessarily, right, that there is every caveat, every red flag could be waved here about this doesn't work for everybody. But as a starting point, you might consider timeframes like this for individual level outcomes and for systems level outcomes, right? These are some typical timeframes that we see in the theory of change. In the resources that you'll get after today, there are also a handful of questions to help you come up with timeframes that go with outcomes. All right, let's talk a little bit about how we connect activities and outcomes. So I'm just going to go jump right into an example here. So if our activity is that we're providing high quality arts instruction, right? That's our activity, that's our blue text. That will lead to increased knowledge of critical arts concepts among students in the short term. Here's our group. Our students are the group targeted for change, and increased knowledge of concepts is the change we expect to see. And in the long term, we think we're going to see more students taking advanced level arts programming. So this is the linkage here, because we expect increased knowledge after we do our activity, providing high quality arts instructions. We expect increased knowledge of critical arts among the students. You likely won't see them engaging in advanced level or expert level arts programming until they have increased knowledge, right? That's why these are stepwise. That's why one comes after the other. So take a sec on your notebook or on your computer, wherever you're taking notes, and do that same exercise for an element of the program at your own organization. So it can be a specific element Jot down what you do and what you think will come from it as a direct result. So by doing A, our participants or our beneficiaries experience B. And then after that, think about something that could happen longer term for them. Jot it down, and then if anyone wants to either unmute or in the chat, share theirs as a statement like this, that would be fantastic. So something you do, and then what comes from it immediately and what will come from it later. And if you already have a theory of change, I guess you could cheat and go to your theory of change and grab an existing activity and outcome. So Sarah gave us one. Providing data literacy training will lead to increased knowledge among participants in applying data literacy skills and increased quality of data work by participants longer term. Fantastic. Fantastic. Yes, exactly that. Thank you. Right? So this is how we link our activities to our outcomes in the short term and then the slightly longer term. Perfect. Let's talk about one more piece, but before we do there, we have a poll. So poll question number 5. Which of the following is a reasonable outcome for this activity? Check all that apply, so it could be more than one. Providing legal aid, and you'll see it pop up, there it is. Providing legal aid for immigration cases will result in what? Take your time, I'll let you read these and answer them. All right. So far, the majority of folks are saying all of these are reasonable. We've got someone saying none of these is a reasonable outcome, and we've got a handful of the other individual options being selected. So the truth is, this is a little bit of a trick question because the answer is really, it depends, right? All of these could be reasonable outcomes for this activity. So everyone that said, the 83% that said all of these are reasonable outcomes, that's probably the best answer to pick. They could be reasonable outcomes, but it depends. It depends on the activity and it depends on the assumptions upon which we're building our program. So let's talk a little bit more about what we mean by that. Let's talk a little bit more about assumptions. So assumptions are, there we are, why we assume a particular intervention will work or why it will have the outcome, it will result in the outcome that we're expecting, right? So we typically base assumptions on one of these 4 things: theory, previous research, and that could be research that we've done, or it could be similar programming that's happened somewhere else, our own previous experiences, or professional hunches. And sometimes they're not even professional hunches, they're just hunches, right? Sometimes you just have a feeling something is going to work and that's enough. I will give you an embarrassing real life example, not so much embarrassing, but I'll give you an example from my own life to drive this home. This is 100% true. So I am involved in the PTA at my children's school, right? And so this is happening this week or last week. So I advocated for, and I'm now leading because I advocated for, a fundraiser where we are hoping to make a few $1,000s, that was my estimate, by having families sign up for a monthly delivery of soft pretzels. I live outside Philadelphia. Soft pretzels are a big thing here. So you pay one flat fee at the beginning of the school year, and once a month on a Friday, you get soft pretzels through the end of the year. And this is great for the kids who like pretzels, right? It's also good for the PTA that would clear a whole lot of money on this, so we could do school programming, community programming, advocacy, etc. So I estimated and made a case to our PTA that we would be able to sell 100 pretzels. That's what we based all of this on. All true. No one really thought we'd be able to sell 100 pretzels because our school has fewer than 150 kids, but I was confident that we would get 100 pretzels. Well, we did not get 100 pretzels. We got close, by the way, but we didn't get it. So we did not achieve our intended outcome, right? So in retrospect, I went back and collected some data and talked to some parents about why they didn't participate in this fundraiser. And I realized that my proposal and my work was based on some faulty assumptions. When we asked parents why they didn't do it, what do you think the first reason that people said, there were three main reasons that people said they didn't participate in this fundraiser. Any ideas? You could put it in the chat. Any ideas what any of these reasons were? Why did they not participate in our pretzel fundraiser? Dietary costs, can't pick up on Fridays, too much work. Where were you people when I needed people to tell me this wasn't going to be a good idea? They preferred cheesesteaks. That is probably a great answer. So the first reason, they said their kids didn't, right there, Unita just called it, their kids didn't like pretzels that much. So I assumed more people liked pretzels than actually liked pretzels, right? Unfair, faulty assumption on my end. I thought more kids would like them. Turns out not that many kids, not as many as I thought liked pretzels. Faulty assumption. Another reason, and I think somebody posted this in the chat, another reason they didn't do it was the cost. So if you broke it down, right, we were charging about $2 and change per pretzel for this. If you go to our local Philadelphia pretzel factory, and there are a lot of them here because of the area that we're in, you can buy that same pretzel for $1. So I assumed parents would be okay with this because the difference was the contribution to the PTA, it's the convenience of and the excitement of having it delivered to your school. Faulty assumption again on my end. And then the third, and this one I really didn't anticipate, but the third reason that they told us they didn't do it was they didn't know about it. So we communicated this to parents via email and social media. And we did not, in an effort to save some trees, we did not send home individual flyers, right? Usually it's an elementary school, so the kids usually take home flyers for everything. And we did not send home flyers, and we did this via social media, and we did it via direct email. And we assumed it would get to the parents that way. And guess what we heard from some parents? They didn't know about it. So another faulty assumption on my end. So 3 faulty assumptions, and we didn't get the intended outcome that we anticipated. Any initiative is only as sound as the assumptions on which it's based, right? That is the takeaway point here. So some common assumptions that we see, if we build it, they will come. If I sell pretzels, they will buy them. Not always the case. Another one that we see quite often, if they participate in our program, behavior will automatically change. Right? We know from research in psychology and human behavior that there are a lot of competing factors in how and why behavior changes. No matter how good our programming is, that alone might not be the lever for behavior to change. There are a lot of other things that have to be assumed for that to actually happen. And this program participation leads to behavior change assumption also assumes that behavior can actually change. So if you read that, the 6 lines underneath, if we're expecting that participating in our program leads to an increase in participants earning a living wage, we're also assuming that jobs are available for those participants, and the jobs that are available are providing a living wage, right? If those assumptions are not met, doesn't matter how good that programming is, we're not going to get to that outcome. So assumptions end up becoming a really critical part of this. As an evaluator, I'll tell you the first thing I check when the activity did not lead to the outcome that we anticipated is the assumptions on which it was predicated. Because if those assumptions were faulty, it does not matter how good the programming was. And often assumptions are unvoiced or they're presumed, right? They're just assumed by the team. We're all doing this for this reason. This is why it's going to work. And that ends up causing either a misunderstanding or confusion in both operations and evaluation of an initiative. So theories of change document the assumptions to ensure there's some kind of agreement. right? And so even if all you get out of this, and I shouldn't say if all you get out of it, because this is huge. If you leave this and you decide to go back and have a conversation with your team around the assumptions, you can create a space where people feel like it's a safe place to talk about the assumptions behind why these connections are happening in your work. You can minimally ensure you're all on the same page about why you're doing it. And why you think those outcomes will flow from the activity. And even better, you could potentially call out each other's faulty assumptions. So if I had had a conversation like this, like the one in the chat right now, that we're having around my pretzels, right? Maybe I would have realized that my estimate was too high. So in the resources section, I provide some questions for you to talk through with your team to help come up with your assumptions if you plan to undertake this exercise. It's not always an easy discussion to have. But I think it's an important one. Oh, someone's leaving us. Bye, Patricia. And the quote, your program or your initiative is only as sound as the assumptions on which it's based. I think that's what I said before. Right, so let's take a hot minute and let's test that out. So that linkage that you worked on a couple of minutes ago, right? Your activity to your short-term outcome to your long-term outcome. Read it again or finish it up if you were still working on it, and consider what must happen, right? What must be true for that activity to lead to that short-term outcome, or for that short-term outcome to lead to that long-term outcome. Jot down an assumption that connects those things. Does anyone want to share their assumption? You can put it in the chat, you can unmute. All right, let's see what we have here. Perfect, so we can continue from Sarah's earlier. So participants have some level of agency over their work. They can make choices and choose to do things differently. They will continue working with data. Remember, Sarah told us about how their data quality is going to go up. So there's a big embedded assumption here that they're going to continue working with data, and that they're going to apply the knowledge and skills that they learned. Right on, right? Great assumptions. The important part here is that these are assumptions that, if faulty, will impact the success of that theory of change, of those connections. That's what makes them really good assumptions in this case. And they are really good assumptions. Because if they're not true, if any one of those is not true, it could impact the extent to which that activity will lead to that short-term outcome, will lead to that long-term outcome. Right? You with me? All right. So let's do a little bit of an exercise. Let's stretch it out a little bit, not physical exercise. Let's do an activity. So I'm going to pull up a Google Doc. And we're going to look at this, this same screen, this same PowerPoint slide in a Google Doc. And we're going to work together to actually put together this theory of change. We're only going to spend a couple minutes on it. But these across the bottom, these black boxes with text in them, are either activities, short-term outcomes, or intermediate outcomes. And we're going to pop them into where they go. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to open up my other screen. And we'll pop them in real quick to make sure that we have this down, and then we can talk about building this. All right, does everybody see my Google Drive page? We good? All right. So let's use the chat for this. And I'm going to highlight one, and you're going to tell me where it goes. So everything is either an activity, a short-term outcome, or an intermediate outcome. And my chat is over on the other screen. So Mare or Betsy or Monica, if you can help me out, it could be really helpful. So what do we think? Participants express interest in new hobbies. We can move these around after we put them in. Do we think that that's a short-term outcome? I'm not telling you intentionally, not telling you anything about this program, by the way. I know that I'm not telling you anything about this program. So just based on what you see. What are we seeing? I'm seeing a lot of short-term in the chat, right? All right, let's move it over. Academic tutoring. Activity, short-term outcome, intermediate outcome. Seeing a lot of activity. We'll move it into activity. Let's go here. Participants report strong personal relationship with others in cohort. Participants report strong personal relationship with others in cohort. Intermediate and long-term, I see you. All right. Participation in team group. Participation in team group. All right. Activities. Participants have been placed into higher level academic courses than prior to program participation. They're now in higher level academic courses than they were before they started. You all are quick. Okay. Participants exhibit interest in becoming mentors. Interest in becoming mentors. Ooh, we have some different ones here. We're going to come back to that one since we have some differing opinions. Weekly cohort meetings. Weekly cohort meetings and activity, short-term outcome. Yeah, that one's easy, activity. All right, increased sense of connection among participants. Increased sense of connection among participants. See, mostly short-term. Participants actively participate in new hobbies. They have new hobbies. New hobbies. Intermediate. I think there was some short in there. One-on-one sessions with a coach. Yeah, activities are usually the easiest, right? Because you can tell what they are. We're going to come back to this one. Enrichment activities. Yep. New relationships are built among participants. New relationships are built among participants. Yep. Short term. Participants increase their academic performance in their current classes. They increase their academic performance in their current classes. Yeah, so you're starting to see, and this is a really hard exercise to do in total isolation, but maybe you're starting to see the connection here. Participants increase their academic performance in their current classes, and look, later, they've been placed into higher level academic courses, right? So there's a short term, there's a stepwise element here, short term and then long term. So let's look at this one. Participants are active mentors giving back to others in the program. And let's look at this one, these two that are left. Participants exhibit interest in becoming mentors. So where does interest go? Yeah, nailed it, right? So interest comes first, which means what's going to come later? This guy over here, right? So that is, and you all just did that without context of the program, without knowledge of the program, without context of circumstances, without any assumptions, and without even a stepwise manner here. So that was a fantastic example on your end of being able to really think about where things flow. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint at the risk of making everybody dizzy of sharing my screens. Right? So in our, back over here, in our magic cooking show way, here's the finished one. And it matches what we just did. Right? So we're able to place all of those things in a way that considers the stepwise nature of them and the activities that lead to those outcomes. And if we had more time, we could sit here and do a whole bunch of work around coming up with the assumptions behind these. But unfortunately, I want to make sure that we get to our steps. So we're going to jump to the steps. But by the way, for anyone that would, oh yeah.
Sorry, Elena, to interrupt, but there is a good question Christina posted in the chat, which is, should each activity have its own short, medium, long-term outcome, or can they overlap?
That is a great question. So they should not necessarily have their own. And in fact, we usually think about theory of change as a funnel when it comes to outcomes. So what that means is you might have the most short-term outcomes, right? From that, those should funnel into a couple of fewer intermediate or midterm outcomes. And then by the time we get to a long-term outcome or impact, we're really talking about 1, 2, max 3 things. So everything should funnel into just a couple of longer term statements, or maybe a lot of people try and bubble it up into one longer term impact statement, which is fantastic, but hard to do. So they shouldn't necessarily map one-to-one. Multiple activities could lead to one short-term outcome, a couple of short-term outcomes could lead to one intermediate, etc. If you're working with different groups, different target populations, it's totally reasonable to have a long-term outcome for each of those groups too. But again, you don't want to usually go beyond like 3 long-term and then you funnel. For anybody that was super intimidated by looking at that really pretty sample theory of change that we saw at the very beginning, our cooking show version of it, this is also a theory of change, right? One more slide with context and assumptions listed out, and you have a completely reasonable theory of change. They do not need to look like what we saw at the beginning with all the graphics and the text to be totally viable and good. All right, so let's talk a little bit. Here's that one again. Right, so here's that really good one. So now that we know all of these components really well, we've talked about all of them, we've talked about how we develop each of them. When you look at this, you might see that you have all these elements here, they're just called something else. So context in this case is our enabling conditions. You might find context renamed as something like external forces, disparity, enabling conditions, right? Sometimes it's not labeled at all, but that's what this is. And then I just want to spend a second talking about our assumptions. Where do you think our assumptions are in this Nourish project theory of change? Type it right into the chat. Where are our assumptions here? Yeah, Janet nailed it. So in this case, our assumptions are our guiding principles. We see this a lot with external theories of change, ones that are really pretty, right? And they get shared with stakeholders, ones that look like this one. There's a reason for that. So our guiding principles are underpinning the philosophy, the approach, why we think this will result in these long-term impacts here, but without getting too deep for an audience that doesn't need all of that detail. Right? Your stakeholders, your funders, all of those folks don't need that big, long list of assumptions, the really nuanced ones. Those are internal. Those are for your team. I don't know who developed this particular theory of change, but I would guess that behind it, there is a much bigger body of work supporting their internal operations, right? That includes all of those really nuanced internal assumptions. For the purposes of an external document, we often see something like guiding principles or values that drive the organization listed to take the place of assumptions.
Elena, I have a quick question. You mentioned internal and external theories of change. Can you talk a little bit about under what circumstances might an organization want an external theory of change?
Yeah, so external is usually for case making. So you want to be able to share that with current stakeholders, potential stakeholders. We often see organizations put it on their website, right, to talk about this is the philosophy behind what we're doing. This is, we are investing in X. So listen, potential funders, listen, potential partners in the community. This is how you understand what we're ultimately trying to get at and how the components of our work will get there. And when it's done externally, it's usually done in a sort of an executive summary way, like this, like the one that we're seeing on the screen here, right? Behind that, the internal version is the one that your team might really work through to get at. And that's the one that you're going to check and kind of recheck. This is more of a communication tool when it's external. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how we build a theory of change. So for a new initiative, some folks said they wanted to build a theory of change for a new initiative. New initiative is pretty straightforward. You do the whole thing essentially backwards, right? So we read a theory of change from activities to short-term to intermediate to long-term. We build a theory of change for a new initiative backwards. points. So first we consider context. We always consider context first, but then we think about the impact we want to have. We think about then the outcomes that would get us to that impact. And then we fill in lastly the activities we need to do to be able to achieve those outcomes. If you're building something brand new, that is the cleanest, most effective way to build your theory of change. And you would come up with your activities last because then you're filling them in to get to those short-term outcomes. Now, there was a higher proportion of people that wanted to focus our conversation today on existing programming. A theory of change for existing programming is built slightly differently, because here we essentially already know what our activities are, right? Or we're already doing them to some extent. So this exercise is more of a check to make sure that all of these connections make sense, right? That these outcomes are reasonable for these activities, that this work all fits within our current context, which might have shifted after the pandemic, that we have consistent language, that there's logic behind what we're doing, or that we have a blueprint to build our evaluation. So I'm going to walk through, we're going to spend a decent amount of time on this slide to talk through these steps based on the components that we just talked about for our last chunk of time. All right. Oh, where did that red line come from? So step one, let's ignore, all right, our red line's going to stick there, but just ignore it. So step one, right, so remember back to the beginning of our session, this is the part where all of these steps together could potentially feel a little overwhelming. Even one of these as a discrete activity could bring value to your team. So don't necessarily consider that you need to engage in every single one. And that is actually the exact reason for number one. So first you have to decide the purpose of your theory of change. Are you using it for evaluation? Are you using it for communication purposes, right? Mayor asked when you would do internal versus external. Depends what you're doing with it. If you're building an evaluation, you need a robust internal theory of change. If you need a communication tool, something like what we looked at from the Nourish project could do it. The purpose of your theory will affect the process that you use, and it will affect who you involve. So are you taking on this whole thing? Are you just convening your team to talk about assumptions? That makes a big difference in your process. Once you're clear about why you're doing it, think about who you want to involve. If you're describing existing work, right, you probably want to involve people that have experience with that work. So that's program staff, that could be program management, and it could be your participants in the program, current or previous, to develop it. And remember, if you include participants, you also move toward more inclusive outcomes and equitable outcomes for that matter. Also, you need to keep in mind the time you have to commit to this process. It can be intensive. How much of it you want to run face-to-face, like workshops, meetings, et cetera, or screen-to-screen, I guess, versus how much you just want to consult on documents. So one of the resources that we'll look at in a couple of minutes is a template that you can walk through if folks are going to work on this on their own, and then you could bring the documents together. And whether or not you want to involve an external consultant. So if you and your colleagues don't have expertise or comfort in theory of change or facilitation of this, it might be helpful to involve somebody external in facilitating this process. It means everybody can participate, but there's also cost and other factors to weigh in. There's certainly trade-offs, but there are people that could, if it made sense for your organization, could facilitate you through a process like that. After you've thought through kind of the logic behind what you're doing and why, you want to give folks a general overview, right? So you want to ensure that everyone has a basic understanding of what this tool is and why you're engaging in this exercise. It could be as simple as sending them some of the slides from this deck. It could be having a meeting where you come together and say, hey, I learned about, or I already knew, or I'm an expert at theory of change. Let me tell you about it. And you talk to them about how it will benefit them in their work. Then you get into the nitty-gritty of it. So that's all the kind of pre-work. First step you're going to take in terms of the actual theory of change is your context. Always start with context. To be credible, a theory of change should be rooted in a clear understanding of the issue you want to address and the conditions in which we're operating. So that context becomes really important. To develop context, you might consider the factors that influence your work. You might pull existing data if you're grant writers or if you're writing grants and you need to pull data for something like a rationale, like when you're writing grants to your funders and you need a rationale for why you're doing this, a lot of that same information is going to be your context. Right? Sometimes you might collect some of your own data to make the case. Sometimes you might do a scan of other service providers and supports that are available to your target group. Whatever you can collect about those factors outside of your organization that could influence your work, you pull that together, you share it with your development team, the team that's developing the theory of change, and you talk about what that means for your work. All of our work should be rooted in context. So after context, you go to the other end and you think about impact, right? When we're developing this thing. So we have a grounded sense of what we're doing. And then we think about what we're trying to address with our work. That's our intended impact. The impact is the starting point for the rest of your theory of change, right? It is the goal toward which everything is directed. It is, when we're going back to that early roadmap analogy, it is the destination in your roadmap. You want to know where you're headed. The impact statement should be should describe the long-term difference you want to see happen. And if you have good insights, because you did this awesome context gathering in the previous step, so if you have good insights about your target population and about your conditions from your context, you'll be better placed to develop a stronger impact statement. That's why we do context first, then impact. All right, so we have context, we have impact. And again, this is, someone asked before about how many outcomes. This is where we usually have only like 1, 2, max 3 things in that impact statement. Now, the next step is where a theory of change for existing work differs from a theory of change for a new initiative. So up until now, it's all the same. If you're creating a theory of change for an existing program or initiative, the next thing you want to do is list your activity anchors. So let me explain what that means. In a lab setting, in a scientific setting, or for a new initiative, right? We would say you work backwards. You do your impact, then you go to your intermediate goals or midterm outcomes, excuse me, then you go to your short term. And that would be totally true. That is the textbook way of how to do this. However, we know that we operate in the real world where everything is not that cut and dry. And maybe there's programming that you do that is not going to change. Maybe you've already committed to something for participants that are in a certain cohort. Maybe your board expects some activities that you just can't cut. Maybe your leadership expects some activities that you just can't cut. And we know that they're going to continue to exist. So an applied application of theory of change is keeping those in mind. So if you're going to be doing that work, list out those activities that no matter what are not going to change. We call those your activity anchors, right? They're not going to shift. So if we're going to be doing that, we might as well lean into that and we might as well use them in building this thing. So we've got our long-term, we've got our impact, that's long-term, and then we've got these couple of activities here that no matter what are going to exist. And then the next step is to connect them in the middle. And this is arguably the hardest part. So you need to think about the changes that need to happen in order to achieve that long-term impact. And then you think about the things that will come directly from those anchor activities on this side. And then this is the art, right? It's not a science, it's an art, because you're combining working backwards from the impact and working forward from the work that you're doing. And you hope that when they meet in the middle, it makes sense and those things all connect. In your resources that we'll look at in a minute, there's a slide for elements to consider when you're establishing outcomes at the individual level and at the systems level, and questions for determining the time frame for each one. But I want to be clear that even with all those resources, this part for an existing program is probably the hardest, because you hope that that all connects in the middle. And sometimes it does, and sometimes there's a little bit of a gap. And when there's a little bit of a gap, it's an opportunity to go back to your activities and say, all right, is there really any room to tweak these, or can we add something to bolster our activities, right? Or you go to your impact and you say, is this really the impact that we're intending to have? Because I don't see that it's going to happen with these activities. So you can go back and tweak at either end. Once you've defined the outcomes, you can worry about the order, the short term, the long term, right? For each one, you think about what needs to happen before the other one, like we just did in that exercise. Interest in mentoring first, followed by experience mentoring. You can figure that part out. After you identify your outcomes, you want to articulate your assumptions. Now, this sometimes happens throughout, right? But if not, you want, and in addition to anything that happens throughout, you want to ensure that you're articulating those things that underpin the connections. And you want to include those that are really critical. You'll come up with a big fat list of assumptions, but you want to include the ones that, if they turn out to be faulty, will derail your work. Those are the most critical. Then we check it, we recheck it. Does it all fit together? Does it all make sense? Does the language align with how we want to talk about our work? Does anybody else need to review this? This is, somebody just asked in the chat, when you include a board, this really depends on your relationship with your board and how involved they are. But this is typically where I would pull in other folks. Other people to review it. The board might look at it. And then after that, this step 9 of bubbling it up, this is, you don't even worry about making it pretty, like the template or the different versions, until you get here. So bubbling it up is really when you take all this really complex stuff and figure out how you're going to make it look, how you're going to make it look. How do we make it digestible? Do we need an external version for our board and our stakeholders? If so, what are the 3 pieces that we want to include? What's our internal diagram version? This is where you make it, where you make a visual if you want a visual. This is where you write it up as a narrative if you want a narrative. Up until now, this has all just primarily been process. And then lastly, as we said at the beginning, this is a living, breathing document, right? So it doesn't sit on a shelf. You should have that theory of change out when you're planning, when you're evaluating, when you're communicating, when you're grant writing, when you're reporting. And so to that end, it should reflect what you do. So if you find that you're writing reports and you're not pulling in that language, something has to tweak. Either the theory of change tweaks, or the report tweaks. If it's not reflecting what you're actually doing or what you're actually seeing, you go back and you tweak it. Minimally quarterly, we recommend that folks pull that out. If they're not using it regularly, every quarter you're pulling it out, you're looking at it, you're making sure it still makes sense. So what does it look like when you put all this together? It looks like this. Right? So you have this backdrop in mind. It's your context. With that in mind, we do these activities. As a result of these activities, we expect these short-term outcomes. As a result of these short-term outcomes, we expect these intermediate outcomes. As a result of these, we expect this long-term impact. And I'm going to show you in about 30 seconds a template that helps get to this sort of step. One other side note, once you have all of this in place, you can get a really good elevator speech or 30-second version of your theory of change from these components, right? Because look, you could do this. The magic of PowerPoint. You say, because of these conditions, we are doing this in order to achieve this, right? That's your elevator speech. And you know that if someone asks more about that, you have all this stuff behind it to explain it. Right? You have these assumptions that link everything together, and you have these stepwise short and intermediate outcomes that get to this long-term impact. So it's just like a nice little cherry on top that you can talk about it in this way, in this simplified way. So let me show you, we have just a couple minutes left. Let me show you what you're leaving with today. I promise the red line won't be in the version that you get. So there are a handful of resources here. When the foundation sends this deck over to you, they will be embedded in them. They're for you to use. The first thing you see in the bottom left, there's a number here, it's 1 of 5. So this is a 5-page template. This is a template should you want to engage, if you want folks to think about this on their own first. So let's say you're engaging your team. It's written up in the order of building a theory of change for an existing program, right? So if you're doing it for a new initiative, you're just going to move these out of order a little bit. For an existing program, you're going to think about context first. Next page, you're going to think about impact, right? So they're going to think about context, they're going to think about impact. Then they're going to think about what we're currently doing, indicating those things that are anchors, and there's space on each of these for them to start to articulate assumptions. Short-term outcomes, what's going to come as a result of that, intermediate outcomes or midterm outcomes, and then you put it all together and it makes a thing that looks like this, right? So everyone can complete that individually. You can come together, you can talk about it, you can tweak it, move forward, and you can start to put together a theory of change. Next document that you have is considerations for establishing outcomes. So we talked about most of these. These are just different places how and where we might see change occur. So as you're thinking about your outcomes, you might see things happen at a participant level. You might see things happen at a systems level. So these are just areas to consider where you might see change. This is helpful even if you don't do a theory of change and you have existing tools and outcomes. You can just always check it against these to make sure you capture the ones you want to capture. And the second page here are some questions for establishing outcome timeframes, right? Short, intermediate, or long term. The next document you have, a whole bunch of questions here for thinking about assumptions. So if you decide to go back and your next step is going to be a conversation with your team around the assumptions for your current programming, you might use some or all of these questions. You'll come up with other questions too. These are just a primer to get you thinking. And then this last page, these are the same steps that we just walked through, but in a slightly different order for folks that are interested in doing this for a new initiative, right? So it's the same 10 steps, but the order is slightly different if you're doing this for a brand new thing. So if you're doing it for a brand new thing, this is what it looks like, steps 1 through 10. And with that, we wrap up. So what did we cover? We covered theory of change. We covered our steps for undertaking a theory of change process. Again, this looks clean and easy. We know that it's not always, right? This is not the television cookie or television cooking model. This can be complex work. It can be sticky work. It can take a lot of effort and time. But I'm hoping that as a result of the conversations that you've already had with your team, the thinking that you've already been doing, and maybe some of what came up in today's session and discussion, you feel like you have some more understanding, some more tools in your tool belt, and that you have resources to be able to continue along that journey. So you can take this back, you can go soup to nuts, you can have one discrete piece of conversation with your team as you move toward this, a more evaluative approach to the work that you're doing. We have 15 minutes after this session ends. I'm happy to stick around for as long as people want to talk. And my email address is here too. If you have any questions, you need any additional resources, or you ever want to talk something through, I am happy to talk with anybody about this work. So just reach out. That is the end of my remarks. I'm going to shoot it back over to Mare in case there's anything else to wrap us up. And then I'll stick around for questions too if people have questions.
Yeah, no, just a big thank you for hanging in and attending the session. And a big thank you to Elena for putting together such a kind of clear, coherent presentation, which you will all receive after the fact. We hope this has been helpful. Please do fill out the survey and let us know what else would be helpful to you beyond this session. I guess the final thing is, please stay on if you've got some questions for Elena. This is your chance to get your own questions regarding your organization answered. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate you engaging in the